Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Katie Smoller. I'm the Director of Educational Programs here with the Journey Through Hallowed Ground. And today we are continuing our journey through the National Heritage Area as we virtually visit with different sites across the area. And today we are fortunate enough to be joined by Nancy Stutz. She is the Education Programs Manager at James Monroe's Highland. So Nancy, thank you so much for being with us today.
It is my pleasure. Thank you for having me today, Katie. Glad to be here.
Thank you. All
right. So I will go ahead and share my screen. Okay. Okay. Well, let's see here. So I am coming to you from the yellow house that you see in this aerial photograph of Highland. It was built after the Monroe era and serves as office space and exhibit space today, but we'll be talking about how it also factors into our site understanding and our site story. But Highland is here in Charlottesville, Virginia, kind of in the middle of the state. It was a former plantation that belonged to 5th President James Monroe, and it's interestingly right next door to Monticello. And people, on tour will often ask, how do Monroe and Jefferson end up as neighbors? How do you get these two side by side? So I want to do a little overview of how does Monroe get established at Highland? What was Highland and what's its historic significance? A little bit of site history with some new understandings we've gleaned about Highland within the last 5 or 6 years. What's coming down the pike, and then take your questions. So let's start by getting Monroe here, because Monroe was actually not from this part of Virginia. He grew up on a plantation along the Potomac River. He, at 18 years old, will join the Continental Army in the American Revolution, and he's actually painted here behind Washington holding the American flag, which some people don't realize. So fighting in the American Revolution in his late teens was extremely formative to Monroe in terms of his dedication to seeing the country through and the founding of America. After the Revolution, Monroe will end up studying law with the governor of Virginia, who was Thomas Jefferson at the time. And they really struck up a good friendship despite their 15-year age difference. And they stayed friends after Monroe studied law with him. And we see in this quotation here from when Jefferson was minister to France, he's kind of daydreaming about coming back home to America and kind of setting up this situation where all his friends have moved to his county. And he writes to Monroe, on my return, which will be early in the spring, I shall send you several he said about books of the French encyclopedia and a plan for your house. He says, I wish to heaven that you may continue in the disposition to fix it in Albemarle. He mentions his secretary, William Short, establishing himself there. He's hopeful James Madison will also move to Albemarle County, and says, this will be society enough, and it will be the great sweetener of our lives. Without society, and a society to our taste, humans are never contented. So this will start the first of more than a decade of trying to get Monroe to get established in Albemarle County, Virginia, where we know he does eventually do that. It will take a while, though. It'll be 13 years before Monroe ever actually moves in the house at Highland. And so to kind of give you a snapshot of when the Monroes and their enslaved population really get established at Highland, it's 1799. We know it's November when they move in. And Monroe, who we see in the portrait here, he was 41 when he finally moves into Highland. So this is going to really be, in terms of his political career, really when his career is starting to take off. His 40s, his 50s, and his 60s. We see his wife, Elizabeth Courtwright Monroe, as well. She was 31 when they moved in 1799. Their daughter Eliza, next to her mother, she was about to turn 13. And then they had just had a baby the summer of 1799, James Spence Monroe. So it would have been a family of 4 who moved in. And great details below from the Albemarle County personal property tax, where we also see a gardener was living at Highland. There were 2 free white males over 16. These are likely overseers. There were 18 blacks over 16 years, 3 blacks between 12 and 16 years. So we only know of the enslaved people who were over 12 years old. We can say there were certainly 21 that year, likely more younger, under 12, that we just don't have a record of because they were not taxed. 15 horses a coach. He paid $1.25 in taxes on his wheels for his coach, and a total of $16.40 of taxes that year for everyone here at Highland. And we know they moved into a house that would have looked something like this, a very typical style wooden one-story home you'd see all over Virginia, with kind of a finished sleeping area on top there. Not the house Jefferson would have designed. This is far too typical for that. We don't think Jefferson ever did design a house at Highland, but just was dreaming about that earlier. And Highland was a wheat and grain plantation primarily. We have a sketch here from a neighboring county of what that would have looked like harvesting the wheat in Culpeper County, Virginia. So they're hoping to make a profit at Highland off of wheat, grains, tobacco on rotation. There was a sawmill, so for selling lumber. They're grinding their wheat into grain, selling barrels of wheat and hogsheads of tobacco down the river. And also merino sheep, for that really superb wool quality they have. So it's kind of, Highland was basically a grain plantation that had mixed industries when Monroe was in residence here. And let's talk about when he was in residence here. I've got a timeline of basically what happened after the Monroes moved in November 1799 through the time they owned Highland. So basically, the month after they move in, Monroe gets elected to 3 consecutive terms as governor of Virginia. That means they're living in Richmond, coming back to Highland periodically. Monroe will then be elected or appointed ambassador to France by Jefferson, where he'll then sign the Louisiana Purchase Treaty. He'll stay and be a minister to Great Britain, also doing a side trip to Spain. Then they'll finally come back to Virginia, probably imagining they'll actually get to live at Highland at this point. A couple years pass, and then he's elected governor for a 4th time. Then we'll leave that stint early to be James Madison, Secretary of State. We see the War of 1812 kicking in here, where Monroe will also be acting Secretary of War. He will then, after Madison's administration, get inaugurated and elected as the 5th president. He'll do a series of tours around the country, really just coming back to Highland in the summers when he can, basically at this point. Then does not retire to Highland after he's president. Had some land in Northern Virginia and Loudoun County called Oak Hill, where retirement will happen instead. You probably won't be surprised to learn that Monroe racked up significant debt, being absent so much, because you can look at this timeline and basically see that there's years where it's just overseers and enslaved people at Highland without the Monroes here. They're either in Europe, they're in DC, they're in Richmond. There's a lot of time where there's no, they were not present at Highland. It ends up actually as more of an absentee ownership situation. And then Monroe, after he's president, he will sell kind of the core of Highland with the main house and outbuildings to one of his colleagues, Edward Goodwin, and then the rest of the property will go to the Bank of the United States. So after 1828, there's just a series of other owners living on this property that formerly, had been this president's plantation. And we get a sense here of, for sale ad of what exactly would have been standing at Highland during Monroe ownership. This is an ad from 1826. Monroe is retired and he's trying to sell Highland and get it off his hands. Says the estate has all the usual improvements on it: a commodious dwelling house, buildings for servants and other domestic purposes, good stables, 2 barns with threshing machines, a grist and sawmill with good houses for managers and laborers, well posted for each purpose and all in good repair. And I will say, from the 21st century perspective, we only have a very few of those buildings identified on our landscape. So we have a lot to still discover through archaeology. And then the remaining enslaved people at Highland will be sold to Florida, which is now United States territory, which happens during Monroe's presidency. and they'll be sold to Casa Bianca Plantation, which is Monticello, Florida, kind of in the northern part. This is a photograph of the home that was once standing there. And we see Monroe writing to Madison, both as retired presidents, where he mentions he sold his slaves in that county, being Highland and Albemarle, to Colonel White of Florida, who will take them in families to that territory. This is paying off a debt of $5,000 that Monroe had owed to John Jacob Astor at the time. And so about 100 years pass from about 1828, when the Highland is officially sold to the Bank of the United States, all the way till 1930, where this is just a private residence where kind of people or different families with no relation to Monroe were owning the property and just bringing their own enslaved people, farming, trying to make profit. And enter 1930, we become more of a historic site as you know it today, where it is open for tourism. And the circle around the little white structure indicates where the tours would have gone. They were touring this little structure on the back of the yellow house, where they were saying that was Monroe's main, that was the house the Monroes lived in. And you may look at that and say that's not the conjectural drawing you showed me earlier in the program. It's also looks quite a bit smaller than you would think for a main residence. But that was the kind of the traditional story here, was that there were rumors of a fire that perhaps had burned down part of the house, and this was a remaining wing. And that story persisted until 2016, which we'll now talk about. And this is the south side of that building we just saw with the red circle around it. So this is what had been, until 2016, portrayed as the main house at Highland. We had a new director start in 2012 who just wanted to kind of understand the property for herself. And so kind of three prongs of research began. We see a photograph here of Carl Lounsbury and Jeff Clee, who worked for Colonial Williamsburg, and they did an architectural kind of analysis of the house, and checking out like the brick patterns, the flooring, the door handles, fixtures, and everything. And they said this would be really, really cutting edge for 1799. We recommend you do something called dendrochronology, which is tree ring dating. And so we had a dendrochronologist from Baltimore come down and take some core samples of our original timbers. And basically what they can tell is the year that the tree got cut down, provided that the core sample has an edge piece for the last year that tree was alive. And so when you get the year the tree was cut down, that can kind of give you a good solid backing for what year that house was probably constructed. And so also a really good archaeological survey, probably the largest ever done at Highland, then took off as well, where they dug 20 or shoveled test pits about every 20 feet apart. And just to kind of see, is there more to the story, and was what really happened to the fire, is what we have really a missing wing, what happened in that time period. And so lo and behold, they started hitting some very significant stone foundation walls underground. And you're seeing, just how well preserved in this photograph that the walls were. And then to the right of that stone wall, you can see where bricks have essentially just collapsed in a pile. And what they were able to tell was that a very catastrophic fire happened to a structure where it basically collapsed on itself, got landscaped over, and kind of forgotten about. And this structure was the precise measurements Monroe's house should have been. We see from an 1800 fire insurance document where Monroe had Highland insured what the house should have been. The structure that we had shown on the back of that yellow house was kind of assumed must be that wooden wing, that smaller part that just survived over time. But it turned out there was a whole other building we found that was clearly this. So then the next question was, well, what was that building we had that survived or that was still standing in the 21st century? Well, that all tied together nicely with the results of our tree ring dating and a letter Monroe wrote. We kept getting back the result 1818 for the wood rather than 1799, like when they were supposed to have moved in. Monroe wrote a letter to his son-in-law on September 6th of 1818, and it ended up really being kind of our Rosetta Stone of what happened. This is when Monroe is in his first term as president. It's a summer when they're home at Highland, kind of taking a break from DC and just spending kind of an extended visit here. And he writes his son-in-law, I have a new house. And he mentions it has 2 rooms, and it's just below the present one for lodgers. He even then goes on to mention this is done by a carpenter I bought of Judge Brooke last winter for $450 in George. So even names the enslaved men who built the structure. So we were able to put it together that what happened was this house for lodgers, or in modern terms, or modern speak, a guest house, survived the fire that burned down the main house and then just went on to be misunderstood, up till 6 years ago. So where we have it, if you visit our site today, where you see the paving stones here in the rectangle, this is where Monroe's house would have been when it was standing. And you'll see it was a classic hidden in plain sight situation. Just right here in the front of that big yellow house, that was built by later owners where I'm speaking to you from. So luckily it was close and truly under our noses. And so we announced this news in 2016 that we had realized that Monroe's house had burned. What we did have was a guest house. We were really excited to put this news out there. But it turned out there was still another thing hidden in plain sight we had not realized. As you see from this online article, this kind of starts circulating the internet and is on the news. Well, a man living outside of Richmond saw one of those articles and happened to comment in social media, interesting discovery. My family was owned by James Monroe. And we learned that there are still people living, less than 10 miles down James Monroe Parkway from us who all trace their ancestry to a man named Ned Monroe, who'd once been enslaved at Highland. And a lot of them are still here in this county. As you see from the article, James Monroe enslaved hundreds. Their descendants still live next door. Something else hidden in plain sight, a descendant community in this very county, right down the road from us. And so since 2016, we've had the privilege of getting to know this family. They formed a Descendant Advisory Council and are now, very critical to as stakeholders to shared authority of telling the history of Highland. We were fortunate in 2019 to get a Mellon Foundation grant to do research and community engagement and new exhibits here on site. And so just this past Labor Day, we pivoted what had been a more traditional guided tour through that guest house into just self-guided exhibits, which you see an image of here from one of our rooms, where visitors just tour the rooms at their own pace. It's now, interpreted as a guest house, embracing that narrative of being just a surviving structure that would have been next to the main house and has its own story to tell. And then coming up right around the corner, we actually just announced yesterday that we are going to be getting more new exhibits, working with Proud Design, who did the Mere Distinction of Color at Montpelier, to redo the spaces I have circled in red here, the kind of yellow house from after the Civil War that we have as office space that will get new exhibits in it, as well as a reconstructed quarter you also see circled, which will have more content about the Descendant Council, their oral histories after enslavement and Reconstruction, more on land ownership and plantations in this area. So it will really expand our ability to tell Highland stories, getting additional new exhibits as well. And so that concludes what I was going to share today. So I will come back here and I would welcome any questions.
Thank you so much, Nancy. That was a wonderful presentation. Those photos were beautiful as well. Was that a drone taking them, or?
Yes, we have some really fantastic volunteers who love to use their drones, and we are delighted to they like to share their pictures with us. So,
It did a great job. It was really
yeah.
beautiful. All right. We're going to be joined now by Ben Kellerals and Anjali Roos. They're two of our interns with Journey Through Hallowed Ground, and they're going to be helping us out with the questions.
Fantastic.
Yeah, hi there. Great presentation. So let's go to our first question from Facebook. Why were so many of the founding fathers in debt?
That's a great and common question. And the overarching thing that's happening is by the 1820s, when Monroe is retiring from being president, we've got, the Louisiana Purchase has opened up the Deep South. We know slavery is going to spread down there. Cotton's going to become king. And it is so much more lucrative to grow cotton than what you can grow in Virginia, which is, grains and tobacco. That the mid-Atlantic just cannot keep up. And you can't switch to cotton up here either because the climate's just not right. And so you have this situation where you're growing what your climate can produce, but it just doesn't make as much money as the Deep South can with cotton. So it starts this literal kind of economic downspin where you see a lot of Virginia plantation owners, no exception, with former presidents, going in debt, selling their land and selling their slaves to the Deep South. It was perhaps a somewhat unanticipated outcome of the Louisiana Purchase, when that happened. So, also in Monroe's case, you saw how often he was gone as a diplomat. That was something he probably complained the loudest about, was when you're a diplomat, it was at a time when Congress would pay your basic expenses, but there's so much entertaining you had to do. Those kind of this assumed out-of-pocket expense that you would need to do to be taken seriously. That racked up a lot of debt as well. And Monroe actually in retirement petitioned Congress to pay him back for some of those expenses he had as a diplomat. They were not entirely paid back, but it was enough that by selling Highland, by selling the enslaved people to Casabianca and the reimbursement, he did, by the very skin of his teeth, die out of debt.
Great, thank you. A next question that we have, there are a few presidential homes in Virginia. Does Highland work with any of the others to tell the stories of presidential history?
In a way, with Monticello and Montpelier so close by, the guides for years have actually had a training session, all three of us, where we would get together once a year and do a training on a topic that related to all three sites. And it was a really great time to connect, just meet other people who have a very similar job and passion to you. So I would say kind of on a more casual basis, yes. There's also the James Monroe Museum in Fredericksburg we work with a lot, and the James Monroe Papers. And we just actually hosted all those folks last week to come see our new exhibit. So it's a very collegial atmosphere. And everyone's very good about, oh, well, you should go to Montpelier while you're here. Oh, you should go to Highland or Monticello. So I think it's just very positive, and I think all the visits complement each other, to do all three. So
We were wondering, some of the staff, I think mainly, and some of our audience members. In 2018, the National History Academy visited Oak Hill, and I remember that well. And the garden that we're seeing from your drone shots looks very similar to the one that's at Oak Hill. Was that intentional, or is that correct?
that may just be coincidental. I am jealous. I have never been to Oak Hill. I'd love to go to Oak Hill, but there's no, to my knowledge, any type of coordinated effort for the similar gardens or anything of that nature. But wow, lucky them to get to go to Oak Hill. That's awesome.
How does the site work to tell the stories of all the people who lived there? You mentioned a little bit about the African American community next door. How do they work with Highland site? How do people collaborate on that?
So about the Descendant Council?
Yeah,
Yeah. So we have monthly meetings with our descendant councils where, there's often some agenda items about this or that's going on. What is your feedback on it? What is your opinion? Do you like this direction? So I would say it's monthly meetings with them, and when we did those exhibits, they read through all the text, approved everything we put in, had suggestions. One of the most popular areas in the exhibits is what came from one of their suggestions, because it was really important to one of the members to talk about colonization in Liberia, which of course, is established while Monroe was president. And so that was, we were already thinking that, but with their enthusiasm for it, we're like, let's also, absolutely, let's talk more about that. And we've been so delighted to have that as part of the exhibits. A lot of folks we realized, aren't familiar with Liberia or its connection to Highland. And so that's been a really great aspect of the exhibits.
That emphasis on diversity or just telling a more true history is something we're seeing at a lot of the founding father sites and other sites in Virginia, but I don't know how many of them have a council like that meeting monthly. That's really something. We always like to, we're running short on time, but we always like to ask our great guide at these sites, how did you get to where you are working at this place? And maybe if you had any advice for young people or anyone that loves history as well and might want to do something like this.
Sure. I thought I wanted to teach, and I did education in undergrad, and I realized it just didn't quite feel the right thing in the classroom. And I realized, actually what I loved was the idea of like field trips. And so I pursued the idea of, you can actually work at museums and historic houses. And I learned that there's public history programs. And so that's what I ended up doing, is then doing my grad school work in public history. And then it was just a matter of, just being open to taking internships. And, one thing kind of leads to another. And so I did work, I did internships at Montpelier, at Eisenhower's home in Gettysburg. I worked as a guide at Monticello for about 6 years, and then that led to this position here at Highland. And so it was all just kind of getting out there, getting exposed, and it worked out great. And so, I encourage everybody to stick with history. It's just a really exciting and satisfying, role to have in your work. And we need new people and more people. And we hope that some of you out there listening will just pursue it and follow your dream if you love history.
Nancy, thank you so much for all of that and sharing your time and information with us today. We truly appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. It was my pleasure to be here.
Everyone at home, thank you for joining us. We'll be back here next week, Wednesday at noon, as we virtually visit with Liberia House Historic Site in Manassas, Virginia. So hope to see you there and have a wonderful rest of your day.